Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading Chapter 8 of The Magicians. So let's get into it. Chapter 8, The Beast. The entire time he'd been at Brakebills, through the first year, the exams, the whole disaster with Penny, right up until the night he joined the physical kids, Quentin had been holding his breath without knowing it. He realized only now that he'd been waiting for Brakebills to vanish around him like a daydream. Even aside from the many and varied laws of thermodynamics that were violated there on a regular basis, it was just too good to be true. It was like Fillory that way. Fillory never lasted forever. Ember and Umber promptly kicked the Chatwins out at the end of every book. Deep down, Quentin felt like a tourist who, at the end of the day, would be herded back onto some dirty, lumbering, snorting tour bus with ripped vinyl seats and overhead TVs and a stinking toilet, and shipped home. Clutching a tacky souvenir postcard and watching as the towers and hedges and peaks and gables of Brakebills dwindled in the rearview mirror. But it hadn't happened, and now he understood. He really got that it wasn't going to happen. He'd wasted so much time thinking, it's all a dream, and it should have been somebody else, and nothing lasts forever. It was time he started acting like who he was, a 19-year-old student at a secret college for real, actual magic. Now that he was in among them, he had some leisure to observe the physical kids up close. When he first met Elliot, Quentin assumed that everyone at Brakebills would be like him, but in fact that wasn't the case at all. For one thing, even in the rarefied setting, Elliot's bizarre personal manner set him apart. For another, he was conspicuously brilliant in class. Maybe not quite as quick as Alice, but Alice worked her ass off, and Elliot didn't even try. Or if he did, he hit it very, very well. As far as Quentin could tell, he never studied at all. The only thing in the world that he would actually cop to caring about was his appearance, especially his expensive shirts, which he wore with cufflinks, even though it cost him regular menial punishments for violating the dress code. Josh always wore the standard school uniform, but managed to make it look like he didn't. His jacket never quite fit his wide, round build. It was always twisted or rumpled or too narrow in the shoulders. His whole personality was like an elaborate joke that he never stopped telling. It took Quentin a while to figure out that Josh expected people not to take him seriously, and he enjoyed, not always kindly, the moment when they realized, too late, that they'd underestimated him. Because he wasn't as self-absorbed as Elliot or Janet, he was the group's sharpest observer, and he missed very little of what went on around him. He told Quentin that he'd been waiting for Penny to snap for weeks. Are you kidding? That guy was a mystery wrapped in an enigma and crudely stapled to a ticking fucking time bomb. He was either going to hit somebody to start a blog. To tell you the truth, I'm kind of glad he hit you. Unlike the other physical kids, Josh was an undistinguished student, but once he'd mastered a skill, he was an exceptionally forceful spellcaster. It was a full 6 weeks into his first year at Brakebills before he was able to move his marble by magic. But when he finally did, as Elliot told the story, it shot through a classroom window and buried itself 6 inches in the trunk of a maple tree outside, where it probably still was. Janet's parents were lawyers, of the high-flying Hollywood consorting variety, and colossally wealthy. She grew up in L.A., being babysat by various celebrities whom under duress, but not very much duress, she would name. Quentin supposed that accounted for the vivid actressy edge to her manner. She was the most viable of the physical kids, loud and brusque, and always proposing toasts at dinner. She had terrible taste in men. The best that could be said of her endless series of boyfriends is that none of them lasted long. Pretty rather than beautiful, she had a flat, flapperish figure, but she used what she had to maximize advantage. She sent her uniforms back home to be tailored, and there was something vibrantly sexy about her ravenous, too-wide gaze. You wanted to meet it and be devoured by it. Janet was about as annoying as a person could be and still be your friend, but Quentin was never bored around her. She was passionately loyal, and if she was obnoxious, it was only because she was so deeply tender-hearted. It made her easily wounded, and when she was wounded, she lashed out. She tortured everybody around her, but only because she was more tortured than anyone. Even though he was part of the physical kids now, Quentin still spent most of his time with the other third years. He took his classes with them and worked with them in PA, and studied for exams with them and sat with them at dinner. The maze had been scrambled and redrawn over the summer, as it was every summer it turned out, and they spent a week's worth of afternoons relearning it, yelling at one another over the tall hedges when they got lost or found an especially sweet shortcut. They threw a party in honor of the fall equinox. There was a strong undercurrent of Wiccan sentiment at Brakebills, though hardly anybody took it seriously except the naturals. They had a bonfire and music, and a wicker man, and a light show by the illusionists, and everybody stayed out way too late, their noses running in the cold fall air, their faces hot and red from the fire. Alice and Quentin taught the others the fire-shaping spell, which was a big hit, and Amanda Orloff revealed that she'd been brewing a batch of mead on the sly for the past couple of months. It was sweet and fizzy and disgusting, and they all drank way too much of it and felt like death the next day. That fall, Quentin's studies changed again. There was less rote learning and gestures and arcane languages, though God knows there was plenty of that and more actual spellcasting. They spent an entire month on low-level architectural magic, spells to strengthen foundations and rain-proof roofs and keep gutters free of rotting leaves, all of which they practiced on a pathetic little shed barely larger than a doghouse. Just one spell to make a roof resistant to lightning. Took Quentin 3 days to memorize, grinding the gestures in a mirror to get them exactly right, at the proper speed and with the proper angles and emphasis. And then there was the incantation, which was in a corrupt old Bedouin Arabic and very tricky. And then Professor March conjured a little rainstorm which emitted a single lightning bolt that sheared through it in one eye-searing, ego-demolishing instant, while Quentin stood there getting soaked to the skin. On alternate Tuesdays, Quentin worked with Bigby, the physical kid's unofficial faculty advisor, who turned out to be a small man with large liquid eyes and close-cropped gray hair who dressed neatly, if extremely affectedly, in a long Victorian-looking duster. His posture was slightly hunched, but he didn't seem otherwise frail or crippled. Quentin had the impression that Bigby was a political refugee from somewhere. He was always making vague noises about the conspiracy that had outstead him, and what he would do following his inevitable return to power. He had the stiff, wounded dignity of the deposed intelligentsia. Okay. One afternoon, during a seminar, Bigby specialized in ridiculously difficult enchantments that transmuted elements by manipulating their structure on a quantum level. He paused and performed an odd gesture. He reached back behind first one shoulder, then the other, unbuttoning something back there. The movement reminded Quentin of nothing more than a woman unhooking her bra. When Bigby was finished, four magnificent insect wings, like a dragonfly's, 2 on each side, sprang out from behind him. He flexed them with a deep, satisfied sigh. The wings were gauzy and iridescent. They disappeared for a second in a buzz of activity, then reappeared as they became still. "Sorry," he said. "Couldn't stand it a minute more." It never stopped, the weirdness of this place. It just went on and on. "Professor Bigby, are you a..." Quentin stopped. "A what? An elf? An angel?" He was being rude, but he couldn't help it. "Are you a fairy?" Bigby smiled a pained smile. His wings made a dry, chitterous rattle. "Pixie, technically," he said. He seemed a little sensitive about it. One morning, very early, Professor March was giving a lecture on weather magic and summoning cyclonic wind patterns. For a portly man, he was surprisingly spry. Just looking at him bouncing on his toes with his red ponytail and his red face made Quentin want to go back to bed. In the mornings, Chambers served terry black espresso, which he smelted in a delicate gilded glass exotic Turkish device, but it was all gone by the time Quentin came down for class. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Professor March was addressing him directly. "Between a subtropical cyclone and an extratropical? Quentin? And the French, please, if you can." Quentin blinked. He must have drifted off. "The difference?" he hazarded. "There is no difference." There was a long, awkward pause into which Quentin inserted more words in an attempt to find out what exactly the question had been, and to say "baroclinic zones" as many times as possible, just in case they were relevant. People shifted in their chairs. March, having caught the delicious scent of humiliation, was prepared to wait. Quentin waited too. There was something in the reading about this. He'd actually done it. That was the injustice of it. The moment stretched on and on. His face was on fire. This wasn't even magic. It was meteorology. "I don't understand," came a voice from the back of the classroom. "I'm asking Quentin, Amanda." "But maybe you could clarify something?" It was Amanda Orloff. She persisted with the shit-eating blitheness of somebody who had academic cred to burn. "For the rest of us, whether there are barotropic cyclones or not, I find it a little confusing." "They are all barotropic, Amanda," March said, exacerbated. "It's irrelevant. All tropical cyclones are barotropic. "But I thought one was barotropic and one was baroclinic," Alice put in. The resulting mass wrangle ended up being so inane and time-consuming that March was forced to abandon Quentin and move on or lose the entire thread of the lecture. If he could have done so unobtrusively, Quentin would have run back to where Amanda Orloff was sitting and kissed her on the broad, unmoistened forehead. Instead, he settled for blowing her a kiss when March wasn't looking. March had segued into a lengthy spell that involved sketching an elaborate Mandela-like symbol on the chalkboard. He stopped every 30 seconds and stepped back to the edge of the stage, hands on his hips, whispering to himself, then dove back into the design. The point of the spell was fairly trivial. It either guaranteed hail or prevented it, one or the other. Quentin wasn't really following, and anyway, the principle was the same. Either way, Professor March was struggling with it. The spell was in a very proper and precise medieval Dutch that evidently wasn't his forte. It occurred to Quentin that it might be nice if he screwed it up. He hadn't particularly enjoyed being called out on technical minutiae this early in the morning. he would play a tiny prank. Brakebills' classrooms were proofed against most forms of mischief, but it was well known that the podium was any teacher's Achilles heel. You couldn't do much to it, but the wards on it weren't quite ironclad, and with a lot of effort and some body English, you could get it to rock back and forth a little. Maybe that would be enough to throw Professor March, the students called him Death March, off his game. Quentin made a few small gestures under his desk between his knees. The podium stirred as if it were stretching a kink in its back, then became inert again. Success. March was reeling off some extra old High Dutch. His attention flickered down at the podium as he felt it move, and he hesitated but recovered his concentration and forged ahead. It was either that or start the whole spell over. Quentin was disappointed, but infallible Alice leaned over. "Idiot," she whispered. He dropped the second syllable. He should have said. Just then, for an instant, the film of reality slipped off the spokes of its projector. Everything went completely askew and then righted itself again, as if nothing had happened. Except that, like a continuity error in a movie, there was now a man standing behind Professor March. He was a small man, conservatively dressed in a neat gray English suit, and a maroon club tie that was fixed in place with a silver crescent moon pin. Professor March, who was still talking, didn't seem to realize he was there. The man looked out at the third years archly, conspiratorially, as if they were sharing a joke at the teacher's expense. There was something odd about the man's appearance. Quentin couldn't seem to make out his face. For a second he couldn't figure out why, and then he realized it was because there was a small leafy branch in front of it that particularly obscured his features. The branch came from nowhere. It was attached to nothing. It just hung there in front of the man's face. Then Professor March stopped speaking and froze in place. Alice had stopped too. The room was silent. A chair creaked. Quentin couldn't move either. There was nothing restraining him, but the line between his brain and his body had been cut. Was the man doing this? Who was he? Alice was still leaned over slightly in his direction, and a fly away wisp of her hair hung in the field of vision. He couldn't see her eyes. The angle was wrong. Everything and everybody was still. The man on the stage was the only thing in the world still in motion. Quentin's heart started to pound. The man cocked his head and frowned as if he could hear it. Quentin didn't understand what had happened, but something had gone wrong. Adrenaline poured into the bloodstream, but it had nowhere to go. His brain was boiling in its own juices. The man began strolling around the stage, exploring his new environment. His demeanor was that of a gentleman balloonist who had accidentally touched down in exotic surroundings, inquisitive, amused. With the branch in front of his face, his intentions were impossible to read. He circled Professor March. There was something strange about the way he moved, something too fluid about his gait. When he walked into the light, Quentin saw that he wasn't quite human, or if he had been once, he wasn't any more. Below the cuffs of his white shirt, his hands had 3 or 4 too many fingers. 15 minutes crawled by, then half an hour. Quentin couldn't turn his head, and the man moved in and out of his field of view. He puttered with Professor March's equipment. He toured the auditorium. He took out a knife and pared his fingers. Objects stirred and shifted restlessly in place whenever he walked too near them. He picked up an iron rod from March's demonstration table and bent it like a piece of licorice. Once he cast a spell, he spoke too fast for Quentin to catch the details. That made all the dust in the room fly up and whirl crazily in the air before settling down again. It had no other obvious effect. When he cast the spell, the extra fingers on his hands bent sideways and backward. An hour passed, then another. Quentin's fear came and went and came back in huge sweating rushes, crashing waves. He was sure something very bad was happening. It just wasn't clear yet exactly what. He knew it had something to do with his joke on March. How could he have been so stupid? In a cowardly way, he was glad he couldn't move. It spared him from having to attempt something brave. The man seemed barely aware that he was in a room full of people. There was something grotesquely comic about him. His silence was like that of a mime. He approached a ship's clock that hung at the back of the stage and slowly put his fist through it. He didn't punch it. He forced his hand into its face, breaking the glass and snapping the hands and crushing the mechanism inside until he was satisfied that it was destroyed. It was as if he thought he could hurt it more that way. Class should have been over ages ago. Somebody on the outside must have noticed by now. Where were they? Where was Fogg? Where the hell was that paramedic nurse woman when you really needed her? He wished he knew what Alice was thinking. He wished he could have turned his head just a few degrees more before he'd been frozen so he could see her face. Amanda Orlov's voice broke the silence. She must have gotten loose somehow and was chanting a spell, rhythmically and rapidly but calmly. The spell was like nothing Quentin had ever heard, an angry, powerful piece of magic, full of vicious fricatives. It was offensive magic, battle magic, designed to literally rip an opponent to pieces. Quentin wondered how she'd even learned it. Just knowing a spell like that was way off limits at Brakebills, let alone casting it. But before she could finish, her voice became muffled. It went higher and higher, faster and faster, like a tape speeding up, then faded out before she could finish. The silence returned. Morning turned into afternoon in a fever dream of panic and boredom. Quentin went numb. He heard signs of activity from outside. He could see only one window, and that was out of the very corner of his eye, but something was going on out there, blocking the light. There were sounds of hammering and, very faintly, 6 or 7 voices chanting in unison. A tremendous, silent flash of light burst behind the door to the corridor with such force that the thick wood glowed translucent for an instant. There were rumblings as if somebody were trying to break through the door from underneath. None of this visibly bothered the man in the gray suit. In the window, a single red leaf flapped crazily in the wind on the end of a bare branch, having hung on longer into the fall than any of its fellows. Quentin watched. The wind flailed the leaf back and forth on the end of its stem. It seemed like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. All he wanted was to go on looking at it for 1 minute longer. He would give anything for that, just 1 more minute with this little red leaf. He must have slipped into a trance or fallen asleep. He didn't remember. He woke up to the sound of the man on stage singing softly and high under his breath. His voice was surprisingly tender. "Bye, baby burning. Daddy's gone a-hunting. Gone to get a rabbit skin to wrap his baby bunting in." He lapsed into humming. Then, with no warning, he vanished. It happened so silently and so suddenly that at first Quentin didn't notice he was gone. In any case, his departure was upstaged by Professor March, who'd been standing out on stage the entire time with his mouth open. The instant the man was gone, March crumpled forward, bonelessly, off the stage and knocked himself cold on the hardwood floor. Quentin tried to stand up. Instead, he slid off his chair, down onto the floor between the rows of seats. His arms, legs, and back were hideously cramped. There was no strength in them. Slowly, lying on the floor in a mixture of agony and relief, he stretched out his legs. Delicious bubbles of pain released in his knees, as if he was finally unbending them after a trans-hemispherical flight in coach. Tears of relief started in his eyes. It was over. The man was finally gone and nothing terrible had happened. Alice was groaning too. A pair of shoes, probably hers, was in his face. The whole room rocked with moans and sobs. Afterward, Quentin would learn that Fogg had mustered the entire staff almost immediately as soon as the man had made his appearance. The school's defensive spells detected him instantly, even if they didn't keep him out. By all accounts, Fogg made a surprisingly competent battlefield commander, calm, organized, rapid, and accurate in his assessment of the situation, skillful in his deployment of the resources at his disposal. Over the course of the morning, an entire temporary scaffold had been constructed around the outside of the tower. Professor Heckler, wearing a welder's helmet to shield his eyes, had nearly set the tower on fire with pyrotechnical attacks. Professor Sunderland had heroically attempted to phase herself through the wall, but to no avail, and anyway, it wasn't clear what she would have done if she succeeded. Even Bigby made an appearance, deploying some exotic non-human witchcraft that, Quentin got the impression, had made the rest of the faculty a little uncomfortable. That evening, after dinner, after the usual announcements about clubs and events and activities had been sullenly and dilatorily attended to, Dean Fogg addressed the student body to try to explain what had happened. He stood at the head of the long dining room table, looking older than usual, as the candles guttered down and the first years gloomily cleared the last of the silverware. He fussed with his cuffs and touched his temples where he was losing his thin blonde hair. "It will not come as a surprise to many of you that there are other worlds besides our own," he began. "This is not conjecture, it is fact. I have never been to these worlds, and you will never go there. The art of passing between worlds is an area of magic about which very little is known, but we do know that some of these worlds are inhabited. Probably the beast we met today was physically quite vast." The beast was what Fogg called the thing in the gray suit, and afterward nobody ever referred to it any other way. "What we saw would have been a small part of it, and an extremity it chose to push into our sphere of being, like a toddler groping around in a tide pool. Such phenomena have been observed before. They are known in the lectures as excrescences. Its motivations are difficult to guess," he sighed heavily. "To such beings we look like swimmers paddling timidly across the surface of their world, silhouetted against the light from above, sometimes diving a little below the surface, but never going very deep. Ordinarily, they pay no attention to us. Unfortunately, something about Professor March's incantation today caught the beast's attention. I understand it may have been corrupted or interrupted in some way. That error offered the beast an opportunity to enter our world." At this, Quentin convulsed inwardly, but kept his face composed. It had been him. He had done it. Fogg went on. "The beast spiraled up out of the depths, like a deep water shark intent on seizing a swimmer from below. Its motivations are impossible to imagine, but it did appear as if it was looking for something, or someone. I do not know whether it found what it was looking for. We may never know." Ordinarily, Fogg projected an air of certainty and confidence, tempered by his natural slight ridiculousness, but that night he looked disoriented. He lost his train of thought. He fingered his tie. "The incident is finished now. The students who witnessed the incident will all be examined, medically and magically, and then cleansed in case the beast has marked or tagged or tainted them. Tomorrow's classes are cancelled." He stopped there and left the room abruptly. Everybody had thought he would say more, but all that came much later. Lying on the floor after the attack, the agony fading from his arms and legs and back, Quentin felt only good things. He felt relieved to be alive. Disaster had been averted. He had made a terrible mistake, but everything was all right now. He felt a profound gratitude for the old, splintery wood underside of the chair he was looking up at. It was fascinating and beautiful. He could have looked at it for forever. It was even a little thrilling to have been through something like that and lived to tell about it. In a way, he was a hero. He breathed deeply and felt the good, solid floor under his back. The first thing he wanted to do, he realized, was to put his hand reassuringly on Alice's warm, soft ankle, which was next to his head. He was so grateful to be able to finally look at her again. He didn't know yet that Amanda Orloff was dead. The beast had eaten her alive. And that is the end of Chapter 8. We will see you guys next time with Chapter 9, and happy holidays!